Most people will leave this video within the first 2 minutes. You will stay until the end, and there is a precise reason for that. What happens when someone encounters content that points at something their current model of reality cannot account for is not random? The mind generates friction. It categorizes the material as not for me and moves on. That response is the conditioned mind doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting the framework it has been operating from. The people who stay are the ones for whom that friction is already familiar. Not because they are more open-minded in some general sense, but because they have been living for some time at the edge of what their current framework can explain. They have data, personal, direct, undeniable, that the conventional model cannot process. And they have been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for a vocabulary that could hold what they already know. If you are still here, you are one of those people. What I mean by the God state is not what the phrase might suggest on the surface. It is not a peak experience, not a feeling of expansion, not a spiritual achievement reserved for the unusually evolved. In the framework of quantum physics, specifically in what David Bohm called the implicate order, the God state is the natural condition of consciousness operating from the depth of what it actually is, rather than from the surface story it has been trained to identify as itself. The 99% do not think the way they think because they are less intelligent or less worthy. They think the way they think because the model they are running was built for a specific purpose, navigating surface-level reality efficiently, and was never designed to process the deeper structure beneath that surface. Once the God state comes online, the model changes, not as a belief, but at the level of the instrument itself. And what becomes thinkable, visible, and possible from that instrument is categorically different from what was available before. You have thought things you did not tell people. Not dangerous thoughts, not irrational ones. Thoughts that were simply too precise, too far outside the available vocabulary, too difficult to translate into ordinary conversation, without watching the other person's face do something that made you feel suddenly very alone. Thoughts about the nature of what is actually happening beneath the surface of ordinary events. About the coherence of patterns that the conventional framework treats as random. About the gap between what the people around you seem to be experiencing and what you are experiencing in the same room, the same conversation, the same set of facts, generating a completely different quality of data for you than for everyone else present. You have wondered at various points whether this represents clarity or distortion, whether the fact that you see what others don't see is evidence of a different kind of access or a different kind of error. The answer, and this is the answer the God state makes available, is that it is access. Specifically, access to the 10%. Carl Friston's predictive processing framework demonstrates that the brain generates reality rather than receives it. Perception is a model the mind constructs and continuously updates based on incoming signal. What most people experience as the world is 90% prediction and 10% direct input. The prediction is generated by the model. The model was built from the past. It filters the present through the lens of what it already knows. The 10% is what gets through the filter, and the 10% is the only thing that is actually new. The God state is the condition in which the filter thins, in which more of the incoming signal reaches conscious awareness, and more of the 10% becomes available. The people who think differently than the 99% are not operating with a different brain. They are operating with a thinner filter. The precision of knowing others cannot access, the coherence you see that others call coincidence, that is what a thinner filter produces. That is the God state beginning to come online. The difficulty with the God state is that it cannot be reached by the self that is trying to reach it. This sounds like a paradox. It is actually the most practical observation that can be made about the process. When the conditioned self reaches for the God state, it reaches for it as an upgrade, a better version of the same operating system. More power, more clarity, more capability, but still the self at the center, still the world around it, still the same fundamental architecture with improved specifications. That is not the God state. That is the conditioned self-simulation of what it imagines the God state to be. Bohm was precise about this. The implicate order is not accessible to the explicate self as an object of experience. The implicate order is what the explicate self is made of. You do not access it the way you access a resource. You recognize it the way you recognize what you have always been, which requires first the recognition that what you thought you were was a structure generated by it, not the thing itself. Every period of your life where the conditioned self's architecture stopped working, where the usual tools produced nothing, where the strategies that had always navigated the surface correctly suddenly couldn't, those were not failures. They were the implicate order creating the conditions under which the explicate self could begin to see through its own structure. The difficulty was the preparation. The difference between the 1% and the 99% is not discipline, not intelligence, not access to better information or better teachers. Those things matter at the margins. They do not explain the categorical difference in what the 1% can perceive, decide, and generate. The difference is coherence, and coherence is a field property. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance research points at something that quantum field theory approaches from a different direction, that when individual instances of a system reach a threshold of internal coherence, they begin to resonate with the larger field in which they are embedded, and that resonance makes available to them information and pattern that was not accessible in a less coherent state. Not because more information arrived, but because the instrument became capable of reading what was already there. Bohm described the implicate order as continuously present, always already unfolded into the structure of experience, always available to the consciousness coherent enough to read it. The God state is not a higher floor you climb to. It is the ground that was always there, that becomes accessible when the noise of the conditioned self's operation stops drowning it out. What this means for where you are right now is specific. The quality of attention you are bringing to this, the particular configuration of readiness, the sense of something like recognition approaching, that is coherence building, not toward a destination you haven't reached, toward a recognition of what has always been the actual ground of your experience. If this content is reaching something you already know rather than introducing something new, and you want to support the work that makes these explorations possible, the link is in the description. Contribute only if it feels aligned. Every bit of support helps this reach the people it was built for. The first time I understood what the God state actually was, I was not doing anything remarkable. I had spent years approaching it the way the conditioned mind approaches everything, as a problem to be solved. Reading everything I could find, testing practices, measuring results, trying to build the God state the way you build a skill through accumulated effort. There was progress of a kind, genuine states of clarity, moments of knowing that arrived before logic. But underneath all of it was something the progress didn't touch. A constant low-level expenditure of energy in the direction of something that kept receding as I moved toward it. The horizon problem. The thing you approach that moves at exactly your speed. What changed was not a practice. It was a recognition that arrived in an ordinary moment, that the effort itself was the problem, that the conditioned self building toward the God state was by definition building a more sophisticated version of the conditioned self, that the God state was not the destination of the journey. It was what the journey revealed was always already present underneath it. Bohm called this the hollow movement, the unbroken, undivided wholeness from which all forms arise and to which they return. The God state is not a form within the hollow movement. It is the hollow movement's direct self-recognition through one particular instrument of awareness. The moment that landed, not as belief but as direct recognition, the effort changed quality. Not less effort, different effort, not building towards something ahead, removing what was obscuring something already here. The 99% operating system is a prediction machine running almost entirely on historical data. Every response, every interpretation, every decision generated by that framework is generated from a model built from the past, filtered through the survival priorities of a nervous system calibrated for a very different kind of environment. This is not a criticism. The 99% operating system is extraordinarily capable at what it was built for, navigating surface reality efficiently, managing the complexity of modern life with automated competence. What it cannot do structurally is think from the implicate depth. The God state is not a state the conditioned mind generates. It is what is present before the conditioned mind generates anything. Bohm said the most important thing about consciousness is not the content of what it produces, but the quality of attention from which it operates. The 99% framework produces content from contracted, filtered, historically conditioned attention. The God state produces content from a categorically different quality, open, present, operating from the depth of the implicate order. The outputs of these two attentional qualities are not incrementally different. They are categorically different. A decision made from God state attention carries different information than the same decision made from conditioned attention. A relationship navigated from God state awareness generates different possibilities than the same relationship navigated from the 99% operating system. The shift from one to the other is not an upgrade of the existing system. It is a change in the ground from which the system operates. The God state does not arrive as a lightning bolt. It arrives as a progressive dissolution of what was blocking it. And that dissolution has specific, recognizable signatures. The first is a change in what commands your attention. The noise of comparison, the anxiety of social evaluation, the pull of distraction begin to lose their grip, not through discipline, but through something more like disinterest. The nervous system quietly reallocating bandwidth from the conditioned self's concerns towards something that carries more signal and less noise. The second is a shift in the quality of problems. The difficult conversation, the stalled situation, the recurring tension start to carry different data. Not easier, more readable. The God state does not eliminate problems. It changes the relationship to them, from something happening to you to something the field is using to reorganize through you. The third is an increasing precision in knowing what is yours to do. The conditioned self takes on everything it can manage because its survival logic demands the appearance of control. The God state has no such requirement. What is not yours to carry becomes increasingly clear, and releasing it is not loss but structural relief. The fourth, most unmistakable once it arrives, is a change in how silence feels. The conditioned self is afraid of silence because silence removes the noise it uses to confirm its own existence. In the God state, silence is not empty. It is the implicate order unmediated, and what surfaces there is categorically different from anything the conditioned mind generates in its ordinary operation. If these are not distant aspirations but present experiences, even partial, even intermittent, the God state is not ahead of you. It is already underway. The conditioned mind is built on comparison. Its entire architecture depends on knowing where it stands relative to others. More successful, less successful, ahead, behind, worthy, insufficient. This is not vanity. It is the operating logic of a system built to navigate social hierarchies for survival. The comparison engine runs constantly below conscious awareness, generating a continuous assessment of relative standing. The God state does not operate from comparison, not because it has achieved confidence, not because the assessment came back favorable, but because the framework that generates the question has dissolved. Bohm described this through the proprioception of thought, the ability of consciousness to be aware of its own thinking process in real time, the way the body is aware of its own movement without requiring separate reflection. When that awareness develops, the conditioned self's comparison engine becomes visible as a mechanism rather than a reality. And what is visible as a mechanism is no longer, in the same way, believed. What arises in place of the comparison engine is harder to name, but immediately recognizable. An orientation, a sense of direction that has nothing to do with where others are going, because it comes from the implicate depth rather than the social surface. a knowing of what is yours to do that doesn't require external validation, because it doesn't originate from a self that needs to be validated. What the God state makes available in ordinary daily life is worth being specific about. The first concrete change is in the speed and quality of pattern recognition. The same information the conditioned mind processes as noise begins to resolve into pattern. What looked like random events begins to carry legible structure. The decision that used to require exhaustive deliberation begins to resolve in the first minute of quiet attention, because the relevant signal was always present and the filter has thinned enough to read it. The second is a kind of immunity to manipulation, not through cynicism, but through something more precise. The conditioned mind is perpetually vulnerable to influence because its comparison engine is always running, always hungry for the signal that tells it where it stands. The God state runs that system at lower intensity. The hooks that the 99% operating system is designed to catch, social proof, status threat, approval withdrawal, land on a surface that is genuinely less reactive. The third is what happens to creative output. The 99% mind generates from its model, from what it knows, what it has seen, what it can recombine. The God state generates from the implicate depth, from the structure of the field that the conditioned model was built to navigate. What comes through the God state instrument is qualitatively different from what the conditioned mind produces on its best day, because it is sourced from a different level of available intelligence. You're already touching this. The recognition building through this material is not the beginning. It is the becoming conscious of something that has been underway longer than you have had a name for it. The reason most people never stabilize the God state, never make it the ground from which they operate rather than the occasional altitude they visit, is not what they think. It is not lack of commitment, insufficient practice, or spiritual immaturity. Those things can be obstacles, but they are not the core obstacle. The core obstacle is physiological. The God state is not a purely cognitive event. It is a whole system event. And the system has a body, a nervous system, a heart-brain interface that either supports or undermines sustained access to the implicate depth. The body, unless specifically trained to sustain coherence, will default to the patterns it was conditioned into, patterns optimized for the 99% operating system, encoded at the level of the nervous system, not just the mind. Bohm described the implicate order as continuously available. The God state is sometimes accessible and sometimes not because the implicate order turns itself on and off, but because the instrument through which it is accessed is sometimes coherent and sometimes running the 99% default. Building the physiological foundation for sustained coherence is the most direct available path from occasional God state access to God state as operating baseline. The link in the description carries a structured protocol built specifically for this. Breath sequences with documented neurological mechanisms, a heart-brain coherence practice built on HeartMath research, and a 12-chapter map of the full architecture from 99% default operation to stabilized God state awareness. Not inspiration, navigation. If what this video named is something you recognize from the inside rather than something you hope is true, that is the structure the recognition needs to stop being intermittent and start being the ground. The God state is not a private achievement. This is the part most content in this space understates, and the part Bohm considered most urgent. The 99% operating system, conditioned mind running on historical data, filtered through survival logic, organized around a separate self in competition with other separate selves, is not just an individual limitation. It is the source architecture of the collective conditions humanity currently faces. The crises of disconnection, short-term thinking, the inability to navigate genuinely complex systems. These are outputs of a collective operating system that cannot, from within its own architecture, generate solutions to the problems it generates. Every individual who stabilizes the God state changes the field in which others are operating, not through what they say, through what they are. The coherence of one instrument raises the coherence of the field that other instruments are embedded in. The tuning fork that finds its frequency does not keep it to itself. Your shift is not private. The thinking you stop doing when you enter the God state, the comparison, the survival logic, the contracted attention of the 99% framework, creates space in the collective field that someone else can move into. Your stabilization is a contribution to a shift that is either happening or failing to happen. And the difference is made by whether enough instruments reach coherence.